On the 6th of October 1960 in New York, a big-budget 70mm epic about a slave who becomes a gladiator and leads a revolt against the Romans was screened. Based on a book by the communist author Howard Fast, Spartacus was Stanley Kubrick's largest production to that date, though it was made under the direct supervision of its leading star, Kirk Douglas. In a film ending with the slaves refusing to point at Spartacus and everyone standing and shouting, "I am Spartacus," it was a far cry from the indignity of HUAC's naming game. More than that, it was a reaction to it. The screenplay was written by Hollywood 10 member Dalton Trumbo. This time, there was no front, no pseudonym, no uncredited contribution. His name, displayed in the majestic wide aspect ratio of the film, stood defiantly. "I am Trumbo." The credit also goes to Kirk Douglas, who took the risk of challenging one of the most long-standing and absurd rules in film history. In 1954, Joseph McCarthy had accused the US Army of harbouring communists. But the televised Army McCarthy hearings, which were supposed to be his moment of glory, instead exposed his aggressive tactics. The proceedings culminated in lawyer Joseph Welch's famous rebuke, "Have you no sense of decency?" This iconic moment marked a turning point, ultimately leading to McCarthy's censure by the Senate and the decline of his influence. But even if this effective attack, along with those by journalists such as Edward R. Murrow, turned public opinion against McCarthy's methods, his decline did not signal the end of McCarthyism or of the Blacklist. In January 1956, FBI officials concluded that communist infiltration of the motion picture industry was, at that time, practically non-existent. Yet, in order to sustain fear for as long as needed, they never bothered to announce this publicly. Even Spartacus, which ironically would become the 7th best-selling film in the history of the Soviet Union, did not change the blacklist bias for hundreds of other blacklistees, who had to go through their own case-by-case process of redemption. There was never an official end to the blacklist. No apology, no explanation, no pardon. In 1931, Darryl Zanuck ran into the screenwriter John Bright, who had recently worked on a film titled Taxi. Zanuck had a copy of The Nation rolled up in his jacket pocket, a magazine someone like him wouldn't typically be caught reading. Seizing the moment, he launched into a question that had clearly been troubling him. "This review in here says Taxi has great social significance." Bright replied, "Yes, it does." "Did you intend it?" Zanuck shot back. "Yes, I did," Bright said calmly. Bewildered, Zanuck retorted, "I'll be a son of a bitch. I thought it was all cops and robbers." After the war, part of Hollywood woke up in fear at how much they had missed in the movies, that it had been more than cops and robbers. In hasty reaction, what HUAC offered was a biased over-interpretation of selected moments of a film, while ignoring the subtleties of the narrative throughout the work. Were the films of Hollywood left subversive? One can open many lines of argument against the notion of subversion in Hollywood films. The simplest, and still most effective, comes from scholars such as John Spardiolati, who argue that if propaganda is so hard to detect, how could it have been truly threatening? The blacklisted writer Waldo Salt spoke of serious pieces camouflaged as comedy, yet he also confessed that he wished they had actually done something significant enough to be worth blacklisting. The way films were made in Hollywood also refutes the possibility of indoctrination. In a system where multiple writers often worked on the same script at different times, how could they form a cohesive and coherent ideology maintained throughout the film, whether infiltrated, smuggled in, or directly and overtly promoted? Even if John Bright was one of the first 4 members of Hollywood's Communist Party, His writing partner at the same time was the politically conservative Kubek Glassman. Even if a certain balance were not reached in their collaboration, the production line foreman always ensured that the popular appeal of the work would not be affected by any excesses or self-indulgences. The question of teaming within the studio system had nothing to do with political alliances. Writers and directors were in most cases cast like actors. John Howard Lawson, for instance, had a reputation for knowing how to write dialogue for a Russian character, even though in reality he had never been to Russia and could not speak the language. The political remarks, formed in a careful balance of drama and personal view, were very often toned down in story conferences with the studio executives. A director's interpretation could also make all the difference, emphasising, underlining, or blurring and eliminating a point, a message, if you like. After the collapse of the Blacklist, those who eventually returned to Hollywood faced a second shock. Nothing was recognisable. The business model and production methods had changed during their long absence. Many of the former blacklistees could not cope and left, this time without the one thing that had previously kept them going through the dark years: hope. They found the new films devoid of social and political commitment. The intellectual forces of Hollywood's left foresaw an even bleaker future. In an unpublished pamphlet titled The Garbage Factory, Films on Fire, Herbert Biberman anticipated the world we now live in.
The children will pay the bitter penalty for the lost battle. They will be assaulted by films which are contemptuous of human beings, which present them as without the possibility of solving their problems, as filled with corruption and degraded sensuality, as naturally violent and illogical.
As part of their struggle for relevancy and to stay true to the activist side of their work, some former blacklistees found the most meaningful framework of expression by tuning into and collaborating with the New Left. The theme that united most of these divergent figures was the question of racial equity. Though racial issues had been present in Hollywood since the 1940s, the civil rights movement now gave them new urgency. One of the earliest examples comes from a time when the blacklist was still fully in effect. Edge of the City, 1957, is particularly notable because a very conservative studio, MGM, hired a blacklisted director, Martin Ritt, to direct an almost neorealist social drama about interracial bonds. The studio effectively unblacklisted Ritt to tell the story of dock labourers, played by Sidney Poitier and John Cassavetes. They recognised that no one else could direct such a film convincingly. Another film, Black Like Me, 1964, tells the story of a former Korean War veteran who, after experiencing temporary blindness, becomes a journalist. Having lost the ability to judge people based on their skin colour, he paints his face black to experience the South from the perspective of a black man. Supposedly based on a real event, this only film, directed by the blacklisted movie editor Carl Lerner, is a rare example of blackface in American cinema used to make a pointed commentary on racism, though it remains an uncomfortable and unconvincing watch. The film stages encounters with different people to reveal varying degrees of inherent racism and convey the ongoing struggle of black people to protect themselves and their communities. One journalist in the film jokes, "It's becoming an illusion that the South is waiting for my liberal message." The film is admirable for its awareness of its own limitations. This positive attitude towards minorities, whether in the stories of immigrants, African Americans or Jews, emerged as a defining feature of Hollywood left. That tradition was renewed when Jules Dassin made Uptight, 1968, a remake of Liam O'Flaherty's The Informer set in a black ghetto. Herbert Biberman created the more politically complex Slaves, 1969, a theatre film hybrid that, through a story set in the 1850s, addressed pressing issues of the late 1960s. John Berry's Claudine, 1974, explored government bureaucracy through the romance of two African Americans, a garbage man and a welfare mother. Martin Ritt directed a series of socially conscious films about black people, though they often carried the white saviour complex. Abraham Polonsky's first post-Blacklist film, Tell Them Willie Boy Is Here, 1969, about a 1909 murder in which a Native American man kills his girlfriend's father, offered a similar political gesture in support of minority rights. In 1976, the first narrative film about the Blacklist was released. The Front, written, directed and acted by former Blacklistees, including Carl Burstein, Martin Ritt and Zero Mostel, turned the black market episode of the Blacklist into a comedy.
What if there was a list? A list that said our finest actors weren't allowed to act. Our best writers weren't allowed to write. Our funniest comedians weren't allowed to make us laugh. What would this country be like if there was such a list? It would be like America in 1953.
Howard, they won't buy my scripts. I'm on a blacklist, you know.
Hey, you want to put my name on your scripts?
I write the scripts. I send them in under your name. They buy the scripts, right?
That's perfect.
What was it that HUAC wanted to achieve, after all? Most likely they sought to use the hearings as both a tool of fear-mongering and political pressure, forcing studios to adopt certain political lines of storytelling, to impose their indoctrination on the movies. They wanted propaganda. If that was the aim, HUAC failed. The left was inconsistent in America, perhaps as it was everywhere outside the communist bloc. Within the bloc, where it was consistent, it often became destructive, if not catastrophic. Yet the Hollywood left created a deeper understanding of the nature of capitalism and its toll on society, encouraging class consciousness, even if the paradox of a society in turmoil is that the large group for whom a small radical minority fights may not be interested in their work. Marxism encouraged collectivism, but in Hollywood the same collectivism, which was always part of the filmmaking process, often led to depoliticization. There were simply too many people involved, coming from varied and sometimes contrasting political backgrounds, each capable of elevating or suppressing an ideology. The Hollywood left was a clubhouse of intellectuals and artists who combined their politics with subtle but lasting experimentation in artistic expression. Their stories addressed the dangers of fascism, union struggles, unwed mothers, the disposition of the wartime working class, prostitution, patriarchy, anti-Semitism, and yellow journalism. The injections of progressive ideas, however, were always in tiny doses. They were not intended to provoke a national uprising. On the contrary, leftist artists were content for these views to be absorbed alongside more familiar lines of storytelling. When these small doses are viewed collectively, and today we can step back and see it more clearly than ever, a picture emerges of a solid movement. The individual films were not always earth-shaking in political or social inventiveness, but there were indeed signs of genius within the body of work created by leftist writers, directors, producers and actors. If we acknowledge the genius of the system, we should also acknowledge the genius of its subsystems. Torn between a romantic notion of the total erosion of capitalism and more immediate issues of labour and racism, the left seized what they could from the headlines to illustrate their points. Yet, in reality, the presumed ideological impregnation of Hollywood films by the left still retained that old, very American tint of middleism, common sense folksiness, and a generally humanist outlook. It had a lyrical touch. What made some of the Hollywood left films so outstanding, whether conceived as allegories during Hollywood's dark years or made in exile, was not the demonstration of Marxist theory, but a deconstruction of society, cinema, and self. There is a tension and an anguished quality in the work of the successful leftist filmmaker in Hollywood and in his attempt to examine the meaning and toll of that success. What we now cherish as the allegorical work of the Hollywood left films reflecting their time and their creators' state of political repression, has taken on new meaning. These works are as much about the present as they are about the past. Some of the works of the Hollywood left resonate strongly with today's politics of retribution, in which those in power employ methods of humiliation and dehumanization against people with opposing views. Political cynicism is undergoing an epic revival in America, a country whose perceived drift towards autocracy has shocked much of the world. The psychological wound of the blacklist has never fully healed, and echoes of it have returned in new forms, abetted by modern means of communication that spread the falsified and the fabricated at the speed of light, often smothering the truth before it is even whispered. Even some of the terminology has resurfaced, though it now circulates in a zone of interpretive subjectivity. The great American writer Dashiell Hammett, who was jailed during the McCarthy era and had his books removed from government-run libraries overseas, wrote a letter from prison to his partner, the writer Lillian Hellman.
I do not know what is going to happen to me or to my country, but if we are to lose our liberties, I would rather lose them standing up than on my knees.
19 years after receiving that letter from Hammett, Lillian Hellman was asked by Dick Cavett what she thought about the years of the blacklist.
How do you feel about today? Does this seem as bad as anything you've lived through, or does it seem somehow comic?
No, I don't think it's comic. I think it's much worse than the McCarthy period. I don't think individuals are being harmed in the sense of the McCarthy period. Yeah. But I think much more than a few of us are being harmed. It's a dreadful time. Don't you think so?
The cycle repeats. Ayn Rand, the anti-communist crusader and author of Screen Guide for Americans, a pamphlet that the FBI reportedly treated almost like a manual, has long been a major influence on Silicon Valley tycoons. Her books have become their Bibles. Roy Cohn, Joseph McCarthy's controversial counsel during the hearings, later became Donald Trump's mentor, an association dramatized in the film The Apprentice. 2 other US presidents were also directly connected to HUAC. Richard Nixon served as a member of the committee and sat behind the desk questioning bewildered citizens who had been subpoenaed. He was described by some contemporaries as the most dedicated of witch hunters. Meanwhile, the friendly witness and former FBI informant codenamed T-10, Ronald Reagan, would also go on to reach the White House. The majority of those blacklisted who had been members of the Communist Party gradually cut ties or drifted away over time. The party itself began losing relevance early on, and many distanced themselves from the very idea of Marxism. The disastrous actions of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves through former believers. The suppression of Hungary in 1956, the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968, and the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 arrived in steady, disillusioning waves. Soviet tanks carried away whatever remained of the Marxist dream. Some Hollywood left people turned to other social philosophies. Others simply held on to the humanism that had always shaped their world and their work. That is ancient history now. Yet the hope it planted in cinema might not be. It promised a cinema that was wide awake, perceptive, compelling, ambitious, popular, oddly lyrical, class-conscious, and probing. Clifford Odets, one of the most important American playwrights of the 20th century and the director of only 2 films in his short life, was among those who eventually collaborated with HUAC and named names. When the news broke, Jules Dassin, living in exile in Paris, reportedly sat on a street corner and wept. With people like him giving in, and the madness of the blacklist and HUAC prevailing, one might imagine an intellectual apocalypse in Hollywood. That was hardly the case. Great films continued to be made. Talented filmmakers and writers left the Communist Party behind, but they did not leave the left behind. Before reaching his own breaking point, Odets had captured a vision of something else, a tomorrow shaped by the battles of today. in the final sequence of his 1944 film, None But the Lonely Heart.
What are you thinking, Madame Boy?
I'm dreaming, Dad. Dreaming the better man. What a go. What a rum go it is. Where's that clean human life the books tell us about? When's the world coming out of its midnight? When does the human soul get off its knees?
I'm too old, Madame, to tell you that.
His words are what remain of the cinema of the left, a warning and an alert to the shuddering in the air, an echo that resonates even in our own troubled times. A better man, perhaps even a better tomorrow.
Sometimes late at night I hear it. A shuddering echo. And I hear it say, wake up. The world needs happiness.
The retrospective on Hollywood Left and the Blacklist, featuring more than 40 titles, will take place at the Locarno Film Festival in August 2026.
Red and Black, Hollywood Left and the Blacklist was written and produced by Ehsan Khoshbacht, presented by Eve P. Thompson, sound design by Rob Sharika.